Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the DeepCool Infinity Series LS520 WH. In this video, I'm going to be installing this 240mm cooler and showing you the process for doing so on two different Intel setups with LGA 1700 and LGA 1200 socket motherboards. You can see it here with the NZXT N7 Z590 motherboard, and a bit more detail on that later on, but I wanted to show you both processes for the setup and hopefully make your life a little bit easier if you're going through an Intel build. Talking about the various different things, the highlights of it, doing some benchmarks at the end, which are very important. I'll show you why later on, and also just testing the performance and other things, including the RGB lighting, which you saw a bit of there. Now, this is RGB lighting that's controlled by your motherboard, so it will vary depending on the motherboard you're using, but the setup for it is fairly straightforward. However, this device is ever so slightly different from others that I've tested, and I'll show you why in a second. One of which is that it comes without any bracket installed to the pump head, which is a point of note. It also has a rotatable head on top of that, so you can change the look depending on how you've mounted it, which is pretty neat. Has RGB fans and RGB on the pump head as well, and you'll notice when you turn it on its side here that there's a little socket which gives you a warning not to remove the label, not to tear it. And this is interesting because this is a setup here which is basically an anti-leak system, which you can see a little bit of here and explain on the box that talks about why and how that works. So over time, you don't need to worry about this system leaking, in theory, in there. And this has pre-filled coolant in it, obviously, so that will run and keep your system cool. As you can see already from these few clips, pre-applied thermal paste, pre-installed coolant, and obviously designed not to leak on it. Also, other highlights include things like clips on the tubes to hold them neatly in place once they're installed. You can see there's a couple of those. You're already seeing a few different cables. You can see some cables coming out of the pump head, and there's some extra ones included in the box. I'm going to go into what you do with these and where you plug them in a bit later on, including close-ups on the motherboard to make life a bit easier. Now, there is a manual included in here, but I'm going to talk to you about some of the things and why, and show off the various different setup processes for it and how I'd recommend doing it. Hopefully you'll find this useful. I'll also leave all the specs in the description for you to check out. Now, you'll find in the box a number of different things, including, as I said, these extra cables you can see here. You've got one bunch together with various different attachments, and then an extension cable, which is very important, and I'll show you why later on. But you can see also a number of different bags with various different attachments again, and that's because it will work with both AMD and Intel setups and various different sockets within that. As I said, in this build, I'm doing LGA 1700 and LGA 1200, so it's worth keeping that in mind. If you want to do an AMD setup, unfortunately, I'm not going to show you that process because I don't have an AMD motherboard to work with. The fans that come included are RGB fans, but they only have a single cable, which is nice. That's because they're daisy chainable, so you basically essentially plug in these cables into one another and then into the pump head, and then running the RGB connection to your motherboard. Now, once you've got everything out of the box, you can see there's quite a few different things laid out here, and it might seem intimidating, but don't worry, I'm going to show you all the different steps and what you do with it. What we are going to do, though, is get rid of the AMD stuff, because we don't need that for this build. So these few bits down here that you can see, I'm just going to pop them out of the way because I'm not going to be using them here. At the bottom, you can see the screws for mounting the radiator, and here are the black little standoffs which are used for Intel. And you'll notice that they actually have 1700 written on them. You'll see there's two different variations. One's a round setup, and the other ones have like a notched edges, so ridged edges around the outside. Those are LGA 1700. The other ones are for the other Intel setups, including LGA 1200. And others. More details in the manual if you're building in a 2066 or 1150 setup, for example. But the process is mostly the same. So what we need to do is to mount the little brackets that are included in here onto the pump head. And you can see that there are screws on either side. And we do need to take care here because in the middle of that grey bit is the pre-applied thermal paste. You need to be careful you don't accidentally wipe that off, because obviously that will go onto the CPU and that saves you from having to put your own thermal paste on, and it'll also make it a lot easier to set up. So you have two little brackets that need to screw on either side, and some small screws included that will screw that down. So basically just securing these brackets into place. I'm speeding up the process here, but 4 screws, so you're basically connecting up. Again, this is for the Intel setup. and it's the same whatever Intel setup you're using. It won't work with AMD, we've already removed that. But here you can see me just going about that process of doing that. One of the things that I did find though, one point of note, is that once you've done this, there is a potential problem, a small one, in that you can't then put the protective bracket back over the top of it. You can't put the plastic cover over there. So that means that you have to now be careful because you might wipe the thermal paste off. So I'd suggest that maybe it might be a good idea to leave that to nearer the end. I've done it right at the beginning, and now I've left myself in a bit of a pickle. Now you can see that you can also rotate the top, so the logo on top of the pump head can be rotated round, so you can change the position of it. This is useful depending on how you're going to position the all-in-one cooler in your case, and where you're going to put the tubes and the wires and where it's going to sit, and that then will allow you to adjust that logo into the place you want. So now what I'm doing is working out the logic of how it's going to fit in the case. I'm using a case which basically allows you to mount a 240mm radiator to the top. So I have two options, either to mount it with the tubes on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side. I'm opting for the left-hand side because I think it will be a cleaner aesthetic here, and basically just trying to work out how that will position and what it will look like and where the tubes will locate. And here you can see those clips again holding the tubes neatly in place, so you can actually neaten things up. It's a good idea to sort of plan this out in theory beforehand, I find, because this often also means that you can then work out where your fans are going to install, which way around they're going to face, and the cables. Also sort of fathom where the cables are going to go. And one of the things that I noticed early on in this build is there's a lot of cables, and I also am aware, painfully, that the case I'm building in and the motherboard I'm using make it quite fiddly once you've installed an all-in-one cooler to get those cables installed. So a bit more on that in a minute, and I'm going to show you what I'm doing there and what I mean as well, because it might be the same problem for you, so it's worth bearing in mind that there could be issues. So the next stage is obviously to work out these fans. As I said, they're daisy chainable, which is actually a delight because it makes it a lot easier to set up in theory. So these are great fans, great all-in-one cooler for this. I'm a big fan of daisy chainable fans. Basically allows you to connect up things a lot more simply. Usually you'd have one cable for power and one cable for RGB. This cuts down on that fuss. So one of the fans plugs into the other one, and then the other connection plugs into another cable that I'll show you in a minute, and you also have to connect the pump head to the fan. So that means that the RGB lighting is on both the fans and the pump at the same time, and that's all controlled from your motherboard software, and I'll show you how later and give a comment on that as well, because this is an interesting setup with this motherboard. So now we've put those all in place. Remember, basically what we're doing here is we're putting the fans to face down into the case. So the way these fans work is they'll pull air in through where the label is. So basically through that front logo label, you're pulling the air through there and then out through the radiator and out the top of the case. The idea here is essentially to pull semi-warm air, because there will be some warm air inside the case, but out over the rad. We have cool air being intaked into the front of the case, so it should keep nice and cool. So mounting them in with the screws, there's some long screws included in the box with a small thread on them, and obviously screwing down all 8 screws into the radiator, and then once again connect up the cables. I'd recommend connecting up as many cables as you can before you go about installing a radiator in the pump, because you will find once it's in the case it'll be a lot more fiddly. So I've got those cables installed, and now you can see this extra one that's included. You will see that there is this one cable here that essentially then leads to a lot of other different ones. There's this one which is for your CPU fan connection, and I'll show you where that plugs in later on. This is the flat SATA power connection that plugs into your power supply unit. Again, I'll show you that as well. And the RGB connection. So you have an RGB connection that will connect up to your motherboard or to other RGB devices. So if you have other daisy chain fans, things like that, for example, light strips, you might be connecting those up. But in this case, I'm just going to show you connecting it straight to the RGB connection on the motherboard. So as I said, daisy chain one fan to the other, and then you have this cable which comes out at the end. Again, that would either connect up to another fan, or it connects up to this cable which then has those multiple other connections on it, including the all-important CPU fan power connection which will connect up to the motherboard. That then gives you a motherboard control over the fans that are on the radiator. Interesting point here, because this is quite an unusual setup. Usually you'd have both the fans and the pump controlled from the same single cable, and you'd usually find that on the pump head, but here it's slightly different. So coming out of the pump head, you have 2 cables. One of those plugs into the fan. This is the RGB connection that plugs into the other end of the fan. So essentially you're creating a loop between them. and we'd stick that in there in the spare slot that we have on this fan here, for example. And that then allows for the RGB lighting to pass through all of them, basically creating a circuit over there. Fairly straightforward. One thing of note though is there is another cable coming out of there which connects up to the AIO Pump header on your motherboard. Now here I have an LGA 1700 Strix motherboard, and you'll notice that there are 4 holes in the corners around it because it'll actually work with a 1200 socket as well. I've done a video separately on LGA 1700. Some AIOs require separate hardware in order to work with that motherboard socket. This one doesn't because it comes with what you need. You just need to adjust the backplate bracket in a way that will fit. You'll find instructions in the manual on that, but basically the little screws that go through there, you can see them sticking through, can just be adjusted inwards or outwards to fit in whichever socket you have, so you just need to adjust them there. As I showed earlier on, you then have these little black standoffs which are ridged, and you can see they're clearly labelled 1700 on them, so you'll know which ones to use for this. You pop them down over the top of that, one in each corner obviously, and once you've done that you can then put the pump head down on top of that and then use the thumb screws to secure it in place. Now I'm just demonstrating this outside of the case to show you how to do it. I'm not actually going to be using this motherboard in the build, but I wanted to demonstrate the LGA 1700 setup for you. So here you just basically put the pump head down over the top of those, and then there's some thumb screws included which you then use to secure it and make sure that it is nice and tight, and that is important. And I'll show you why you need to make sure it's secured properly later on, because otherwise you may find there are temperature issues. As I said, there's a cable that comes out of the pump head that needs to plug into the AIO Pump fan header. You can see that on this motherboard is down in the left corner just below the CPU. There's chassis fan 1 and then AIO Pump header there. Now I'm going to plug that in now just to demonstrate, and again, I'm showing this all outside the case just so you can get a clearer picture of it, because it's quite difficult to get a footage of it when it's inside a case and it's a bit darker. But I also want to demonstrate that now of where that would plug in. You might find that this is in top right. Sometimes it's in the top right instead of below the CPU. It varies in its placement, so you might have to refer to your motherboard manual to find out where that is, or just keep a keen eye on your motherboard and a close look, and then you'll find it, hopefully. Alternatively, you may use a CPU fan header if you haven't got an AIO Pump header. Now, you have the breakout cable from the fans on the radiator, and as I said earlier, you then need to use either the CPU fan or CPU optional fan headers on your motherboard. These are usually in the top right. You can see that just above there it says CPU fan, and then I'm using the CPU optional, so you have the option of either of those depending on your motherboard setup again. Then the RGB connection, you're looking for the 5-volt RGB connection, not 12. And you'll see on the right hand side, top right of this motherboard, there's 2. The one on the right is the 12 volt, and the one on the left with 3 pins in it, that's the one we need, is the 5 volt. That is essential for the RGB lighting, so it's really important you plug that in if you want to get the RGB. You can see at the bottom of the motherboard, we also have 2 more of those RGB connections, same 5 volt logic. Now swapping over to the NZXT N7Z590 motherboard, this is LGA 1200 socket, and as you can see, I'm using Intel Core i7 11700K for this build. Now this is the same sort of logic. You have that same backplate that sticks through from the rear, and then you're using the round standoffs instead of the 1700 ones. You can see these are marked 115X, but they will work with 1200 as well. So if you're using an 1150 motherboard setup, that's what you do with that. Again, we can then seat the pump head down on the socket and install it. Now, usually I'd go about installing the radiator first and securing the pump last, but there's a lot of cables here that I know need to be plugged in just above the top of the motherboard, and that there will be a real fiddle to sort out otherwise once I've installed the radiator, and that's because of the size of the case and other things. So I'm doing this first, and this might not be the best way to do it. It depends on the size of your case, but I have actually found that this is a better way to do it here, simply because of the number of cables I've got to install. I've got to install the CPU fan header, the AIO pump header fan connection, and also the RGB connection, and run those cables through to the back, and it's a little fiddly, so basically securing those down. As I said, make sure those thumb screws are nice and tight. Now I'm looking for that pump header connection at the top here. I'm going to plug that in. You can see AIO Pump on this motherboard on the right, and on the left-hand side of that, the CPU fan. CPU fan will be used for the fan connection that's coming off the radiator. Don't forget that. So now I have the AIO Pump from the pump itself, and then obviously the RGB lighting as well can be connected, but I'm going to run that to the back. So we have the breakout cable with all the different things here connected up, and I'm connecting up the CPU fan cable first from that radiator connection bundle. Again, that's on the left-hand side. You can see here next to the power connections for the CPU as well. And then I'm going to run the other cables through to the rear. Obviously, we also need to make sure we connect up the SATA power connection, the RGB connection, and then basically run those cables through there to tidy things up a bit because there's quite a lot of cabling. So now I'm going to put the radiator into place, mounting on the top. And what I'm going to do now is quickly secure that with a couple of screws in this position where it's laid down, just to make sure it's secure there. And then I'll stand it up and put all the rest of the screws in. I'd recommend gently screwing in some of them and not fully securing them until you've got the case in a position where you can check it. Make sure you're happy with where the radiator is mounted, and then screw all the rest in and tighten it up so it's nice and tight. You can see on this case, for example, there are various different spots for it. I could push it more towards the back or more towards the front, depending on the aesthetic that you're after. So it's worth doing this, just making sure that you've gently secured them and then adjust. So you can see me adjusting it here, and then I can basically tighten up all those screws and sort it out so it's in the position that I want it to be in. But again, the process here is essentially the radiator will be pushing hot air out of the top here and then cooling the CPU down. I'm going to do some tests in a little while to show you the performance of it. I'm happy to report it actually runs really well and quite cool too, surprisingly cool actually, and I was pleased with it. So now those cables are all important cables again. You can see that I have the SATA power connection. That's a flat power connection. Now if you're not sure about power connections and where you run those, what goes where, I've done a video separately on the RM850 power supply unit from Corsair that you can see in the bottom of the case, where I go into depth on all the different connections that you need and how they work and where they plug in, so be sure to check out the link to that in the description. The RGB cable, you can see me trying to run to the bottom of the case, and I've realised it's a little bit short, so I'm going to show you what you need to do there in a minute. And the SATA power connection, that's our flat connection. You can only plug it in one way, but there we have it connected up, and that's straightforward. This is the same sort of cable that you'd use for hard disk drives and for SSDs. Now included in the box with the cooler is this little extension cable, which I foolishly didn't use, and I should have done. I didn't realise how much extra cable I was going to need to run to the RGB connection. That's the one cable that's causing me a problem here. So essentially this is just one cable that connects up to the other breakout cable essentially, and that basically just extends the length of it and gives you a bit more flexibility in that cabling. So I'd recommend using that before you go about the build process and not do what I've done and have to mess about with it. An important point of note. And then obviously that gives me more length in those RGB cables, makes it easier to reach the bottom, because I was just a few millimeters off being able to plug it in, which is quite frustrating. But a small point, hopefully it will be useful. And I'm using the bottom left one simply because, as you can see now, I've mounted the radiator. It would have been a fiddle to plug it in at the top right. So I have two options here for the 5-volt RGB connection. So just plugging that in down the bottom. This is important. Again, make sure you use this because you will need that for your motherboard software. So whatever software comes with your motherboard will then give you RGB control over it. You can see that you have lighting on here as standard, but when you go into Windows, you can then adjust the RGB lighting from your software. In this case, I'm using NZXT's CAM software, but other motherboard software will also work with it. You'll find Aurora Sync from Asus, for example, will work too. Now, peeling off the labels, and we're finished. That's the job done. You can see it running now, and some of the RGB lighting here. I did find, however, that the RGB didn't play that nicely with this NZXT motherboard. There are only a few different settings that I could change between, which is a bit of a shame, but I don't think that's down to the cooler itself. I think that's actually NZXT software, and you will find that you can adjust a lot more lighting within other software. And you can see we have some nice lighting from both the fans and the pump. I was pretty pleased with the setup here, and it ran really nicely as well. And in a second, I'm going to show you the all-important benchmarks, because one thing I found is that on the initial run, it ran really hot. As a usual step in benchmarking and testing various different coolers, I always run Cinebench and other tests. Now, these usually need to be taken with a pinch of salt because it will vary depending on what fans you have installed in your case, the atmosphere and other things. But it's also an important thing to do, so I'd recommend doing it. Cinebench R23 is a free bit of software that you can download, and also hardware monitor that you can see on the right hand side is also free. Cinebench puts your CPU under pretty heavy load, much heavier than you'd usually get when gaming and other things like that, and runs a variety of different tests, putting pressure under there. And it will then basically cause your CPU to run really hot, which then obviously tests your cooler to see how well it's performing. The alarming thing that I found almost immediately after just a few passes was that it was running very hot. So you can see under the temperatures of the cores and the package, I was getting 102 degrees C and 94 and some of them 100 on others, 96, variety of different temperatures on there, but alarm bells are ringing because this is far too hot. So I immediately powered it down once I'd recognized that this was a problem to check on what the issue was. The fans were spinning, and I know that the cables were connected up properly for both the all-in-one cooler and for the fans, so everything should be running as well as it should be. So I then basically went about the process of checking on what was going on inside, and I found that I hadn't quite tightened up those thumb screws enough so that the CPU pump head wasn't sitting as tight as it could have been on there. So it's really important, again, to make sure that you tighten it up. You need to make sure it's nice and tight, but be careful not to over tighten it because you can also cause damage as well. So I basically just tightened that up and then I ran the test again. And now, as you'll see, the performance is much better, significantly better in fact. So you can now see that once I've done that and secured it down again, I've turned it back on, I've gone back into Windows and running Cinebench again. Same test, I wanted to make sure that everything's working as it should be. You can see the CPU's on 100% load according to NZXT's CAM software. And that will give you a little bit of information about the performance of the cooler in terms of how hot things are running. But I prefer to use CPU ID hardware monitor because it just is a bit more granular. And you can see here the temperature of each of the cores. And the overall package is now 68 degrees C instead of 102. So we have a much, much cooler system here. And this is multiple passes of Cinebench right near the end. So it ran really well and significantly cooler. And actually, this is really cool for this run as well, for this CPU and for this setup. So really good cooler, really good performance, nice RGB lighting, a reasonably easy setup, and overall a great bit of kit. Hopefully you found this video useful. Be sure to check out all the links in the description and other information, as well as links to both the motherboard, a PSU, and the case video in case you're curious. This has been The Provoked Prawn. Thanks very much for watching. This has been The Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.